Hey everyone, this is Mike Turner reporting from Pro Sound and Stage Lighting's showroom. Today we're going to spend some time talking about PA systems in reference to loudspeakers and kind of how to figure out what kind of speaker is going to work right for your application. As we know, the active or powered loudspeaker type has been growing greatly in the last few years as technology has advanced. You can get more power out of these, you can get internal crossovers, and they're a lot more controllable and a lot more user-friendly. And then we have the traditional, ever so popular passive system where you require some extra components to make the speaker work. So this might be somewhat rudimentary, but at the same time we want to make sure that everyone's on the same page of some of the basics of what you need to make these systems work and what kind of applications they're going to work best in. We'll start off by explaining a couple things with an active loudspeaker system. So before I go straight into that, basically the way a speaker works, there's going to be a tweeter, and then there's going to be a cone, there's going to be an internal crossover, and then there's going to be some sort of a power system that's going to send the signal and power to those speakers so that they can replicate the sound. In an active loudspeaker system, the amplifier is going to be built inside the speaker itself. So there's no need for external cables with respect to sending power to the speaker or anything of that nature. You simply just plug it into the wall, you send it its audio signal, and you can attenuate the volume and level with the onboard controls, and you're pretty much good to go. Most active loudspeakers these days have an internal crossover, so it will be able to designate which frequencies go to the cone and which frequencies will go to the tweeter, which is obviously taking a lot of the technical work out of your responsibility. And that's one of the main reasons people like this. You take the speaker, put it on a stand, give it an audio source, plug it into a wall, and it's ready to go. You don't have to buy a fancy rack. You don't really need any extra components at all. A lot of people like these, but there are some downfalls to that. Again, because the manufacturer sets the crossover points, you don't really have any control over that. So the uber techie guy or techie audio professional guy doesn't have the kind of control that he's probably used to, and he may not like that. There's also kind of I guess you'd call it a misconception that powered loudspeakers have less headroom, if you will. The reason being is the amplifier inside is built specifically for this particular speaker. So we can kind of touch base on that a little bit, but essentially what I wanted you to understand is a active loudspeaker is getting its power source from an internal amplifier built within the enclosure itself. Okay? Now we're going to talk about a passive loudspeaker. Imagine this same thing, but the amplifier is not built inside. There is no components, nothing, no tricky electrical stuff. It's literally just the tweeter in a two-way system, and the horn, and then you just really have an insert, essentially. And there's some crossover points as well. But anyway, they require an external amplifier, and I'll kind of walk you over here. Something along these lines that will actually send it the power. Now, one thing I want to make sure everyone takes note of, there's a huge misconception with these knobs here. Everyone seems to think that this is a volume knob. It is not a volume knob. It is an actual level or an output knob. And this can definitely be displayed by the fact that I can turn these all the way up when the amp is on. And yes, you will hear a volume increase, but that's because I'm sending more juice to the speaker. But if I have this plugged into a mixer and I turn the main levels all the way down, you will hear nothing, yet these volume knobs are up all the way. So again, just kind of to touch base on that, a passive loudspeaker system requires an external amplifier, which in return will require cables to come from the amplifier to go to the speaker. So now that we understand the differences in the two major type of loudspeaker systems, we're going to talk a little bit about applications. And again, this is up to interpretation, but I'm just going to give you some rules of thumb that will kind of help you figure out what type of system will work best for you. So we'll start off with your mobile DJ. This is a customer that might be doing the gig in different types of venues each night. He has no idea where the stage is going to be before he shows up. I mean, he is just completely mobile. That sort of person would probably most benefit from a active or powered loudspeaker system. Main reason being, typical mobile DJs are usually bringing in 2 loudspeakers and sometimes a subwoofer. The amount of gear that he has to bring in to make an active loud system work is a lot less than a passive. He doesn't need a rack full of components. They're going to do all the fancy work for him because it's already done inside of this. So that's typically where you're going to go with that. And that doesn't mean a mobile DJ can't or won't want to use a passive system. It just requires some extra components, extra cables. Might take a little bit longer to set up. So the gist of this, again, to understand, is that an active loudspeaker is meant to be plug and play. Some scenarios where a passive loudspeaker system are going to work best are generally going to be permanent install. And I'll give you some tips on that. But the main reason being is that because the speakers aren't being moved, a lot of people like to run the cables around the parameters of the building. And then they have a central station where the amplifiers are mounted, typically where everyone can see what's going on. And I'll give you an example. And this is a real example that I've worked with with some of the club owners that I've worked with. If you have a active loudspeaker system in a nightclub, and let's say you've got different DJs that show up on the weekends, typically your speakers are going to be mounted on the ceiling, right? And as a rule, you can't tell when the speaker is clipping, and I'll touch base on that in a moment. You can't see when the red lights are flashing that tell you, hey, turn this down. So the problem is you'll have this entire speaker system that there's no indication of whether or not you're sending a bad signal, and you've got multiple DJs that are coming in, and their mixer says they're doing something fine. So you could be damaging your speakers and not even know it. With a passive loudspeaker system, as a rule, the amp rack, which is really where the components are that are susceptible to peaking, are going to be usually right where the audio system is. So when you have things that are clipping, you'll have an amp rack that you can say, oh, well, that light's flashing, I'll turn it down. So those are some things that you're going to want to think about because, again, if you can't tell when you're clipping, you can't tell when you're hurting the speaker. So with that being said, so generally, any permanent install situation, may it be a church, a school, nightclub, anything of that sort, a passive loudspeaker system is probably going to work best. Another reason why a traditional active loudspeaker may not be best for a permanent install is that because generally these things have a power switch on the back. Unless you have the speakers all on the same circuit, you would have to get on a ladder and turn them all off. Again, if with a passive system, all you do is shut the amplifiers off and you could have a speaker that's 100 feet away turn off because you cut its power. So just some things to think about there. Another characteristic that differs from active and passive loudspeakers is the ability to chain them. Now, one thing that might be in favor of the active loudspeaker system is, again, because the amplifier required to power that specific speaker is located on the back, which means if I've got a large room, maybe a banquet hall, that I might have 8 to 12 speakers running, I don't have to worry about ohm ratings or anything like that at all. All I'm doing is daisy chaining the audio signal. That's it. The power is evenly distributed for each speaker because, again, the power is located right on the back. It gets a little bit more complicated when you're working with a passive system. So with respect to the passive loudspeaker system, you've probably seen on the box of your speakers an ohm rating. And it'll typically say this speaker runs at 8 ohms or 4 ohms. Essentially, an ohm rating is a measurement of electrical resistance or impedance. Now, the reason why this all makes sense, and this is going to be kind of tricky, so try to pay attention. We'll use an example of a stereo loudspeaker system where you've got one speaker on the left channel, one speaker on the right. 99% of the time, that speaker, if it's just a single 12 or a 15 with a horn, that's going to be an 8 ohm speaker. So the amplifier is going to be sending 8 ohms to one side and 8 ohms to the other. Now, what if I want to add 4 speakers, meaning 2 on each side? Well, the ohm rating literally is divided by the amount of speakers that you have. So if you have 8, and then you have 2 speakers on that side, 8 divided by 2 will give you a 4 ohm rating. Okay? So just kind of keep that in mind. If I were to add 3 speakers, then at that point, you're going down to a 2.66 ohm rating. Not that many amps will handle 2 ohms, just so that you know, but in any case, essentially that's the way that works. So, you might be asking, well, what does ohm ratings mean? What does that reference in respect to my speaker system? Well, an amplifier runs most efficient generally at an 8 ohm rating. But you can actually open the floodgates, if you will, on an amplifier by adding more speakers. So the way that this affects you, you might have an amplifier that it'll say it'll run 800 watts per channel at 8 ohms. So what that would mean is that each speaker on each side, so back to our analogy where we have 1 and 1, is getting 800 watts. And then you might see where it says at 4 ohms per side, it might send 1200 watts. Now again, reverting back to what I just said, we realize that 4 ohms means we're using more speakers. Yet the amplifier is saying that it's going to give more juice. How does that even make sense? Well, without giving you an electrical engineering class, essentially what ends up happening is the more speakers you add, the less resistance. The less resistance, the more electrical current that's flowing through. So just kind of keep that in the back of your head. So now going back to the power and the ohm ratings, one thing that you can do to get more juice out of your amp or more power is to run it in a bridge mono. What that essentially does is you're taking the power that would be distributed to channel A or 1 and the channel that would be distributed to channel 2 or B, and you're combining that power into one signal, which is great for subwoofers or great for a scenario where you're running an odd number of speakers that you're going to be running in stereo. And a lot of people hear the term mono and they think, oh, it's only going to be sending the left or just the right, and I'm not going to hear the entire mix. Well, keep in mind, most mixers have a left and right out. If you just simply get a Y cable and bring it into a single channel, then you're going to be sending stereo to those speakers even though you're only using mono signal, if that makes sense. So I wouldn't worry about that. That's one way that you can get a lot more power out of your speaker by simply using, again, bridge mono, which means you're bridging the power of both channels into a mono signal. Again, that's more commonly used for subwoofers and odd numbers of speakers. Now we know a little bit more about the various types of speakers and kind of how they work. Now granted, I wanted to go into a lot more detail, and I definitely could, but at the same time, I don't want this video to be 2 hours long. Just know that you can call us. We'll be here to answer all of your questions. I'm sure you have questions about crossovers, how they work, what they mean to your system. You know, when should I use an EQ? When should I use a sonic maximizer? These are all things that pertain to the subject that we're talking about today. And later on, we'll do more videos about that as well. But again, the point of this video is to kind of explain the differences in what may work best for some, may not work best for others, and vice versa, and what you can kind of expect. But again, we are here to answer your questions. Everyone here is factory trained. At least twice a week, we've got a manufacturer's representative over here teaching us the specifics about their speakers and their equipment, and we know what's going on. We have resources to go to. If we don't know the answers, we're going to get them. But at the end of the day, we're going to make sure that you leave ProSound with the right system for your application, and you're going to have all the questions answers that you could possibly need. Anyhow, I'm going to go ahead and sign out for now. This is Mike Turner at ProSound and Stage Lighting. We're here to answer your questions. Have a good day.